While not directly or explicitly political in nature, the imperative report is further predicated on the observation and conviction that to properly fulfill this mandate, to sustain the informational needs of a citizenry consistent with the demands of maintaining the policy selection relevance and operational viability of democracies and open societies under conditions of both increasing systemic complexity and an increasing number of challenges of a transnational nature related to issues of quote-unquote the commons, news and public affairs media need to have a thematic orientation and purview which transcends the largely unquestioned, indeed virtually reflexively habitual, preoccupation with largely short-term, incident-related, and crisis-oriented topicality in subject selection and investigative attention. In other words, and contrary to apparently prevailing wisdom, the major challenge for creating a more relevant and illuminating news and public affairs journalism does not stem only, or perhaps even primarily, from the tsunami of business model disruption enabled by the technological disintermediation enabled by the internet and social media obvious in the current environment. And the implications of this, for either good or ill, depending on whether the problems are corrected or not, are enormous. So the ultimate objective of these introductory comments and this invitation to participate is to lay the groundwork toward establishing a new kind of news public affairs multimedia venue which would be corrective of these problems. But precisely because of the noted inadequacies and failures of orientation embodied in much existing content, they are also driven by the recognition of very significant and exciting opportunities for correction. But because the underlying problem is as much one of process as it is of content or flawed orientation, fully leveraging some of the innovative collection, organizational, and collaborative potentials of new media constitutes a major part of this opportunity. Yet citing the problematic nature of the existent dominant, myopic, and reactive preoccupation with short-term crisis topicality, apparently often extant for no reason other than the fact that it embodies reflexive procedural assumptions and tradition, and it so easily accords with the financial and ratings demands of a 24/7 commercial news cycle of conventional media, somewhat begs the question of what other factors might also be part of the problem. I would reiterate two. First is the absence of sustained continuity of coverage, or conversely, a content production vision generally of an episodic nature, which considers a given subject covered, as it were, if a report, and emphasis on the singular, on a given subject has been logged. Second, and closely related, is presuming that the issue of a topic or subject constitutes an isolated and self-contained silo, rather than being a node, if you will, in a much broader and highly dynamically interactive network, somewhat analogous, in fact, to the formal idea of a semantic network. Indeed, these two factors have a mutually, perversely self-reinforcing effect, the latter presumption justifying the former, and the former reinforcing the inbred oversight regarding complex connectivity and all of its important implications for social, economic, and ecological systems governance, including how investigation and reportage in the context of such connectivity should be conducted. And while these problems of orientation and operational bias may often be perfectly innocent, relatively harmless, or even appropriate for certain types of more or less local and genuinely topical content, it is anything but appropriate or adequate as fulfillment of the larger socio-political imperative of sustaining a truly well-informed citizenry on subjects of great policy salience, anything but adequate for the kinds of subject content of fundamental significance which might be construed as constituting the deeply underlying tectonic drivers, as it were, of the future, in the context of a period of civilizational transition. Amazingly, often overlooked in their broader tectonic aspect, as opposed to reportage on a single incident singular incident manifestations, such as, say, the Gulf oil spill, in spite of their importance as persistent underlying drivers. Indeed, based on following the disjointed topical and episodic output of conventional journalism, one might never even come to realize that there are deep, underlying tectonic drivers at work, let alone be led to consider what they are and how we should frame questions meant to guide us in making collective decisions about how those forces should be channeled toward constructive and sustainable outcomes. Another limiting factor of conventional television and journalistic content generally is that it is inherently passive. It is an inherently passive consumer-viewer experience. Conversely, problems with emerging new media, citizen journalism, say, universe include being both episodic and thematically completely scattershot in nature, generally so embedded amid a plethora of other unrelated triviality that time-attention burdens of discovery can overwhelm consumption benefits of even meritorious content once it's found, and may suffer from the absence of more rigorous editing, fact-check, and related verification and other journalistic or scholastic standards of oversight. As envisioned, the Imperative Report would be radically different on both scores. Organic to the vision and operational modus operandi of the Imperative Report is leveraging of various new media technologies, wikis, social media groups, online open source multimedia production capabilities, possible gamification engagement, engagement and mastery criteria, etc. The list could be quite long, to facilitate a level of interactivity with and participation by the audience reaching far beyond merely the proposal of new article or show ideas. In effect, the vision for this new venue is to leverage these new technologies not merely to organically and virally grow an audience, but to facilitate audience participation in content selection and production to an unprecedented degree. Importantly, however, because of both the guidance inherent in first establishing predefined thematic categories of content targeted for production and airing, and the intended aggressive participation outreach to relevant university media and academic departments, important academics, authors, publishers, and NGOs, etc., related to these content categories, as well as to the many professional journalists no longer employed because of the crisis in conventional journalism. Such processes of citizen contribution would not occur in a vacuum or in a context without appropriate academic and professional journalistic editing, fact-checking, and other related rigorous oversight. This highly dynamic endogenous interplay would serve both content quality and audience growth, with the audience, somewhat placed in quotations, becoming as involved as producers of content rather than just as totally passive consumer viewers as they're able or choose to be. The key points for emphasis regarding the nature of the Imperative Report then would include the following. A. Providing an alternative to the severe limitations of conventional topicality, incident, crisis, news cycle-driven reportage by initially defining these key quote-unquote tectonic or grand challenge categories to be targeted for coverage. Then dynamically assess and carefully modify those selections over time based on audience involvement, perhaps including something like an annual Imperative Forum. B. Selected categories and subcategories would receive sustained continuity of coverage on some regular or semi-regular cyclical basis, the exact details of which might vary contingent the research production demands appropriate to the given focus of any given installment, with point of focus for future installments for a given category or subcategory, then being contingent on audience participant feedback based on what was learned in the previous installment, and the feedback, analysis, suggestions, etc. of a virally growing and significantly quote-unquote prosumer audience of general citizens, academics, scholars, policy participants, etc. C. Leveraging powerful new media technologies and procedures to systematically establish the symbiotic interactivity between the academic and professional journalistic guidance with a prosumer audience of citizen participants in content production within and between these categories. D. On an ongoing basis, very broadly facilitating participatory relationships with relevant authors, publishers, university departments, whether media and journalistic in nature or scientific analytic, key NGOs, foundations, etc., to both grow the audience and also the prosumer participant nature of the audience. And E. Defining criteria for weighing how much say, as it were, any given audience member and participant may have in key decisions relating to content category inclusions or modifications. Analogous perhaps to the U.S. Constitution, it should be neither too easy nor impossible to amend a tectonic category selection once accorded that status. Installment focus and their installment cycles, if when installments which might explore linkages between and among the broad content categories might warrant being elevated to a category in their own right, etc., depending on factors such as participant longevity and significance of production involvement or other criteria. To be continued.